Right. So the wheel of life, sometimes called the wheel of existence, a wheel of becoming, or Bhava Chakra. Bhava Chakra is the Pali word for wheel of becoming. And it's a well-known and ancient Buddhist symbol. It's often called the Tibetan wheel of life. It actually goes back before Buddhism reached Tibet, which wasn't until the 7th or 8th century. And the Tibetans developed it into this complex and comprehensive form that we see today, which me put up on the screen. And it's a very popular image in Tibetan Buddhism. And the image is commonly depicted on the walls of Tibetan monasteries and temples. And we've even got one now down at the Ipswich Buddhist Centre that Trish, one of the Sangha painted, but I haven't seen it yet because, well, I haven't been there for over a year, so I think it's come more recently than that. But it's something that will be a very good image to have on our wall. And before the Tibetans really took it on and developed it, it may well have adorned the walls of the monasteries there, but none of these monasteries have survived, so we don't really know. I mean, there's even a tale, a legend about the Buddha himself explaining his teachings by drawing a picture in the sand with a stick, but who knows if there's anything in that. But it certainly evolved from a rudimentary form into this elaborate Tibetan version that we're familiar with today, or some of us are familiar with today. Some of you might not have seen the image before, of course. So we know it developed over time, and we actually do know that the figure of Avalokiteshvara, which appear in the 6 realms, was added as late as the 14th century by Tsongkhapa, Tibetan master, and he also increased. There was 5 realms, and now it's 6 as we come to the realms of existence that Mogavajra will be talking about tomorrow. So don't take this imagery in its traditional meaning as sort of being a scientifically validatable formula. It's more something to reflect on. And it probably first came into existence as a teaching aid to help largely uneducated people by depicting the Buddha's teaching in images so that they relate and understand. So that was a function of it. Not why I picked it today, of course, that you can probably understand the teachings without the diagram, but it does help. And what does it symbolize? It symbolizes life itself. Some things come into being and pass away. And we can look at it as a map of the human condition. Sangha, the founder of our movement, once said, and I quote, "The wheel of life is not a picture at all. It is a mirror in which we see what else but ourselves." So, it can be likened to a mirror, looking at the ways in which we function. Our experience of the world in our spiritually unaware state, default way of operating, if you like. And there's 2 main interpretations of this image. One is looking at it as a process that continues from lifetime to lifetime, and the other as sort of a more immediate process occurring within moments of consciousness in a single lifetime. A bit more about that later. So traditional Buddhist teachings tell us that unenlightened beings are caught up in this vast process of constant rebirth. We are born, we die, and reborn over and over again. That's a traditional Buddhist outlook. And this wheel of life keeps revolving, or we keep moving around it. This cyclical process is known in Buddhist terms as Samsara, a word which you may have come across before, as opposed to nirvana, another word for enlightenment. So in the Buddhist day in ancient India, well, the idea of this 2,500 years ago, the idea of rebirth was commonly accepted. Whereas today we're a bit sceptical about the idea, to say the least. But that's a discussion for another day. Basically, we don't know one way or the other. A big mystery to us. So, as I said, another way of looking at this, it represents us moving from one mental state to another in our present lifetime. You know, the concept of impermanence. Whichever way we look at it, like everything else, we are constantly changing. Things are constantly changing. And the wheel of life describes the mechanisms of this process of change. So I'll say a bit about the wheel in general terms. Well, some of the other imagery in there before we come to um, the main topic of this talk this morning is the hub of the wheel. As you can see, this wheel is held by this monstrous figure, this monster called Yama, or Yama Raja, the king of death, or the demon of impermanence. It's known as both in both terms. If we look at the top right-hand corner, standing outside the wheel, there's an image of the Buddha pointing. He's pointing to the top left-hand corner. And this version of the Wheel of Life, there are several versions, but commonly he's pointing at the moon. And in this moon, there's a hare. Not all versions, but in this one, and I think the one I showed earlier, there's a picture of this hare. Now, what's that all about? What does a hare signify? In fact, I'll have to show this off. I've got this lovely hare rupa. You know, a hare. It's a hare. So I don't need to share a screen a picture of a hare. Here is one. Quite a lovely thing. I didn't buy it for that. I bought it because I just liked it, actually. Anyway, so the hare. Some of you might have heard of the Jataka tales. It's a large, I think there's over 500, a collection of Indian folk tales, which actually appear in some of the Pali Canon, I believe, at some point. And Indian folk tales, or morality tales, if you like, that have been adapted to recount the previous lives of the Buddha in both a human and animal form. And in one of these stories, the Buddha was a hare, or the Buddha-to-be was a hare who offered himself as a meal to feed a hungry monk. Obviously, these are fables, not to be taken literally. So the figure of the hare in the moon represents the Bodhisattva, which is how the Buddha described himself prior to his enlightenment. He said it in many texts that when I was an unenlightened Bodhisattva, because we normally think of Bodhisattva, well, it actually means enlightened being or being of enlightenment, but it also means the Buddha prior to his enlightenment. And actually, there's a very interesting talk I listened to a while ago on Free Buddhist Audio by Ratnaprabha, and it's called The Hare in the Moon. So it's quite easy to find, Ratnaprabha, The Hare in the Moon, and he relates that tale. And it's interesting, he also says that while we talk about the man in the moon, in the hare in the moon, and not only in the East, in other parts of the world, in South America, in other indigenous cultures, I think the Native Americans talk about the hare in the moon, and even the Celtic people of Great Britain, well, whatever it was called then, talked about the hare in the moon, whereas we now say the man in the moon. So yeah, so the hare's got that imagery. I think it's also an astrological symbol as well. So that's the hare. I had to say that so I could show my hare rupa. So the wheel itself, if you look at it, it's divided into 4 concentric circles. So in the middle, the hub of the wheel, are 3 animals, each biting the tail of the one in front. And I'll come to that. That's what I'm going to talk about a bit later in this talk. So that's the hub. The next segment is divided into 2 parts, a white half and a black half. And again, I'll talk about that shortly. And the next layer is the 6 layers of existence. That's all I'll say about that, because Amoghavajra is going to be talking about that layer tomorrow morning. And the outer rim represents the fundamental Buddhist teaching of dependent origination or conditioned co-production, which I'll be talking about later this morning after tea. So I'll be talking about talking in terms of this word dukkha, which some of you might not be familiar with. Dukkha. It's what it means is, it's often translated as suffering, or there are various other terms for it. Suffering's a bit strong. Unsatisfactoriness is another way of talking about dukkha, or ill ease, disease. Basically, life gives us a bumpy ride. That's the way I like to look at dukkha, a bumpy ride, because I've seen, with a bit of creative etymology, is that the word? The word do, it means, in Pali, ancient Indian language, do means bad or not good. As ka refers to ill-fitting will, and what do you get if you've got an ill-fitting will? You get a bumpy ride. So dukkha, bumpy ride, unsatisfactoriness, being ill at ease with life, not getting what you want. So that's what dukkha means, which you'll be hearing that word quite a bit during the day. So this cyclic distance explains the chain of how dukkha arises and how we can escape this predicament. As I said, I'll be talking about that later. And this afternoon, I'll be talking about the positive and the dharma chain, or the spiral path, as Sangha has described it. Okay, well, let's go to the middle. So in the middle, the hub of the wheel, are 3 animals, each biting the tail of the one in front. The bird represents craving or greed, the snake aversion, and the pig ignorance or delusion. So the bird is actually, we say it's a cockerel quite often nowadays, but it's actually a bird. It's probably still living in India. I don't think it's extinct, but it had a particularly strong attachment to its partner. So that was how this Indian bird became the symbol for greed. The snake represents aversion or hatred. It bites at sight as a provocation. Also, a lot of snakes are poisonous, aren't they? So that's the image, the animal which signifies hatred. And the pig represents ignorance, so or delusion. So greed, hatred, and delusion. Actually, I used to wonder: is the pig greed, or is it ignorance? Because, of course, pigs are greedy, aren't they? Or thought to be greedy pig. Or we also get ignorant pig, which is a bit of an insult. But so I couldn't remember which way round it was. But then I came not so long ago. If you put a P in front of ignorance, what do you get? You get pignorance. So the pig is ignorance. So I'll never forget that now, and perhaps you won't either. Remember ignorance, put P in front. So there you go. One way of remembering it. So these three unhelpful states of mind, greed, hatred, and delusion, they're known in Buddhism as the three fires or three poisons. We normally poisons, that drive us much of the time, drive us around this wheel of existence. So just aside here, the Buddha used the term three fires. He often used metaphors based on religious practices of the time, and it was a duty of Brahminical householder to keep through. That was the prominent sort of religious practice of the time, this Brahmanism. So it's common for a Brahmin to keep three fires alight, and the Buddha interprets these three fires as the fires of greed, hatred, and delusion. So the word for enlightenment in Pali is nirvana, which comes from the roots va to blow and the prefix nir, which means to blow out. So it means to blow out nirvana. But this metaphor of the three fires, got changed over the time and known as the three poisons, as we usually refer to them these days. So greed or desire or attachment, hatred, aversion, ill will, ignorance can be thought of as confusion, delusion, misperception. And these are inextricably interlinked. So we'll have a look at ignorance to start with, because it's because of ignorance that greed and hatred arise. Now, it's been called the primordial poison. So ignorance or delusion, perhaps delusion's a better translation. It's the Indian word is avidya, which you might come across in certain texts if you read texts. So it's not ignorance in the sense of knowledge, lack of knowledge, but spiritual ignorance. Someone may know a lot about the world, but they have a total lack of insight into the way things actually are, the true nature of reality. Now, which we've all got. We're making progress possibly, but we have got a lack of insight into the way things actually are, to a lesser or greater extent. And we all experience some degree of delusion, but it's very difficult if you're deluded to realize it. That's the nature of delusion, isn't it? So it's pervasive, but perhaps we can spot greed or hatred in their various forms. We can perhaps spot those, but delusion's a bit more difficult. So we hold on to our delusions as well, don't we? They serve us in some sort of protective way, the views we have about what's what, if you like. So delusion is basically, as I said, our inability to understand the nature of things as they really are. So an antidote to overcome this delusion, antidote to the poison, if you like, we need to cultivate wisdom. Wisdom, insight, and right understanding or right view. We're learning to experience reality as it actually is, without laying on our distortions of our self-centered desires, fears, and unrealistic expectations. So if we sense and act in accordance with the ever-changing nature of the world, then we're going to suffer. This dukkha arises. But if we begin realizing that everything is interdependent, impermanent, never changing, we realize that all living beings are interrelated, and lasting happiness does not come from external things, then we're making progress. A lot of people just have the opinion that amassing possessions, money, etc., will bring lasting satisfaction and happiness, but or relationships will last, whereas often they don't. So Buddhism teaches that this is not the case. If we look for lasting satisfaction in things that are by nature impermanent, will ultimately bring disappointment. So it's not easy to overcome these delusions or misperceptions about the world. There's no quick result. But the Buddha taught that if we overcome these three poisons that cause us all this suffering or dukkha, our lives can be transformed. And he taught the Four Noble Truths. There is suffering, the cause of suffering. There's a way out of this suffering, and the path to end suffering, the Noble Eightfold Path that some of you will be familiar with. So, to begin this work, we need to start where these poisons originate. So we're working on the mind, and that's, of course, where meditation comes in. So, better talk about the other two poisons a bit. So, let's have a look at craving. Craving for things we like and craving for the absence of things we don't like, or which is normally called aversion. So the goal is to develop an attitude of detachment to worldly pleasures, rather than being selfishly attached to them. Contemplating their impermanence, the limitations of sense pleasures. So how can we begin on this process, this long process? One obvious way is to cultivate generosity and gratitude. Being grateful for what we've got rather than wanting more all the time, I've seen the claim that gratitude and greed are mutually exclusive. It's not possible to be grateful for something. It's not possible to be grateful for what you've got and want more of it at the same time. I wonder if that's true. Perhaps we could talk about that when we go into our discussion groups. Do we think that's true, that we can't be grateful and have greed at the same time? So our desires, our greed can be fitted into five major categories. Wealth, sex, fame, food, and sleep. We try our best to get more of these things we enjoy and how to prolong them. And we can probably see that if we spend our entire life changing these desires, we're bound to disappointment, we're going to suffer. And of course, modern society and consumerism feed these desires. You get these adverts for must-haves, don't we? Feeding a sense of lacking something. A feature of modern life, which I'm sure we're all familiar with. So hatred. Now, hatred is a strong word, isn't it? Hopefully most of us don't have out-and-out hatred for people or things. Anger comes into this category as well. So how do these emotions feel? Well, they feel bad, of course. Our mind naturally wants to feel calm and happy. And it won't feel calm and happy if we're angry or feel ill will towards somebody. And of course, the antidote here, which was already practiced this morning, well, if you came to the second session, second meditation session, is loving kindness. Meditating on loving kindness. which, as I said, most of us has done, the metta practice. Now, developing selfless love towards others. Um, Metta, sort of unconditional love. Okay, so that's the antidote to hatred or ill will. So if we're governed by these states of greed, hatred, and delusion, we will have painful consequences. And if our actions are based on the opposites, love, generosity, awareness, kindness, there'll ultimately be pleasant consequences. And this is what's depicted in the next circle of the wheel. I'll just say a little bit about this. It's really self-evident, actually. But the next segment in the wheel, can you have it again? Yeah. You see the next segment outside the rim, the hub. It's divided into two parts, a white half and a black half. So in the white half, or the white segment, beings, due to their skillful deeds, are ascending into the light, into the heavenly realms. Okay? And those in the other half, due to their unskillful deeds, are tumbling down into the hell realms. I'm not suggesting that these are extremes. I'm not suggesting that we're all tumbling down into the into hell because we harbour a certain level of greed, hatred, and delusion. These are the extremes. But this segment can be considered to represent karma. Actions have consequences. Wholesome or skillful actions have the potential for us to live a happy and fulfilling life. And with unwholesome or unskillful acts, hold us back, resulting in suffering for ourselves and others. Well, I think I'll finish there. I've been talking for over half an hour, so we'll finish at that point. So, how are we doing for time? We could go into discussion groups now. We could have 20 minutes and then come back together again, and then we'll have a tea break. Hope that's okay. Nobody's gasping for a cup of tea. Wait another 20 minutes or so. What we could talk about actually is just a couple of suggestions. You can talk about anything you want to talk about, hopefully sort of connected with the wheel of life. Do we think that greed is mutually exclusive with gratitude? Have you found the metta practice helps in overcoming ill will? Is that your experience? And perhaps how can we cultivate more wisdom? Okay, right. So somebody can put us into smaller groups.
They've all gone. Right.
Still recording, Swadeepa. I didn't know if you knew that.
The wheel of life, which is probably the most important one, and might even been the first one to get sort of formulated in a pictorial form, because it's one way of expressing a fundamental Buddhist teaching. There are other ways, but the fundamental Buddhist teaching is that of conditionality, conditioned co-production, or sometimes called dependent origination. Now, Paticca Samuppada, to use the Pali words. And what this means is that basically everything that exists and that is everything, including the universe, everything that exists has come into being dependent on causes and conditions. And when those causes and conditions cease, that which depends upon them cease. I'll just say that again. Everything that exists has come into being dependent on causes and conditions. And when those causes and conditions cease, that which depends upon them also ceases. So nothing exists in total isolation, which would bring us on to another important Buddhist teaching, that of insubstantiality, but I won't go into that now. No thing exists in total isolation. I think a good example, a simple example, is that of a plant and its life cycle. You take a seed, for instance. Well, a seed will sit in a drawer or in a packet for years, perhaps even centuries. I've found old seeds, but now, given the right conditions, the seed will grow into a plant, won't it? It'll need some moisture, it'll need some warmth. When it germinates, it will need sunlight, it'll need nutrients from the earth, other things, and it will grow into a plant. The seed will grow into a plant because the conditions are there for it to do that. But of course, if any one of those conditions that brought it into existence cease, like you don't water it, it doesn't get water, it doesn't have any sunlight, runs out of nutrients, etc., then it'll cease to exist eventually. It will die. So if one of the things that brought it into existence is no longer there, then eventually it will cease to exist. Yeah. So that is a sort of very simple example of conditionality or conditioned co-production. Yeah. Which is kind of makes sense, doesn't it? But the Buddha himself said this teaching was deep, hard to understand, subtle, and beyond logic. So there's a lot more to it than that. But we've got to start somewhere. So an images like this outer rim of the wheel of life can be a useful starting point. It's not something to be taken too literally, though. Now remember, it's a basis for reflection. It's not a logically foolproof, hard and fast system. It's not sort of a scientific proof or anything like that. So if we look at the outer rim, can you put the image up again, Swadeepa? Okay. So we're looking at the outer rim now, the one on the outside. Oh, good. Right. Yeah, got it. And I'll go through the link shortly. We normally go around the wheel of life. If you've done this before, these called the 12 nidanas. Nidana being a word meaning link. It's the most usual translation. And usually this, you start the links with the links in this system. It started at 1 o'clock. The picture of that, well, it's a man with a stick. It's supposed to represent a blind man who can't, see basically where he's going, which depicts ignorance, if you like. I'll come back to that in a minute. So starts with ignorance and goes round to the final section, which is about 11 o'clock. The corpse being carried to a cremation ground, presumably, and that is the final, the 12th link in this 12 nidana chain. So that's the way we normally go around the wheel, the outer rim of the wheel. But it's more logical, actually, to start with old age, sickness, and death. The one where the corpse is being taken to the cremation ground, signifying death. old age, sickness, and death. Because that's where the Buddha would have started out. It's fairly logical in that why did he go on why did he leave home and go on what's called his noble quest? Well, the usual answer to that is that he, he could see that human beings get old, they get sick, and they die. Now, there's the legend of the four sites, isn't there, that some of you might have heard of, which I think now is usually considered just a legend, an allegory. It didn't actually happen, but it's a good way of looking at what the Buddha saw, or he became dissatisfied with life as it was. He could see that he too was going to get old, sick, and die, and he wanted to know why. What is life's meaning? Why are we here? Why does it have to be like that? And that's why he went on his so-called noble quest to find the answer to these questions, which he did in the end. So he would have started with that link, wouldn't he? He would have started at the 12th link and work his way back. He'd say, what are the conditions for, what's the condition for old age, sickness, and death? And then he'd have gone to the one which is about 10 o'clock, birth. That represents birth, that image. You can see a small baby there. So if there's no birth is a necessary condition for old age, sickness, and death. And then he worked his way round, at least until about 3 o'clock. So you can go clockwise or anti-clockwise. It's said that the Buddha actually, he figured out the sequence from death to name and form, which is the one with, can you see it, about 4 o'clock? He worked that out before he was enlightened. It wasn't until after he was enlightened that he worked out the final answer that ignorance feeds or starts off this whole cycle leading to old age, sickness, and death. In fact, I did come across a sutta where, it sort of suggests this, called the Nagara Sutta. And that's strongly suggestive of that was the case. He sort of finished, and I think it's in other texts as well, with this, what we call name. Well, I'll go through this in a minute. Perhaps I'm a bit premature in saying this, but name and form, conditioned by consciousness, which is conditions with name and form. But we'll come to that. Don't worry about that now. Okay. So traditionally, these links are seen as taking place over 3 lifetimes. There's a 3 lifetime model for these 12 links. A past life, present life, and future life. Now, I won't go into that now. In fact, the Buddha never said anything about 3 lives. It was something that came later in the commentaries. What the Buddha taught was these 12 interconnected links are ways in which dukkha arises. And as he said many times, that what he taught was that there is dukkha and ceasing of dukkha, which is a couple of the 4 noble truths, of course. So this 3 lifetime interpretation came later. I think it was first, or it was sort of set in stone in the text, the commentary called the Visuddhimagga, which was written down about 1,000 years after the Buddha. And scholars sort of debated this, that it's still going on, the argument that some people say this 3 lifetime thing's nonsense, some say it's not. But the other interpretation is that it is happening on a or a moment to moment thing. These links, you can interpret them into moment to moment thing in this lifetime. We'll say a bit more of that as we go through. Okay, so it's not necessary to believe in rebirth to appreciate this teaching. It's a metaphor or story about the human condition. Okay, so we look at the sequence as kind of mnemonic. Mnemonic? Just words that start with an M. Anyway, also help us understand the human condition. And remember, it's not a scientific formula in the sense it's hard and fast. There are numerous versions and interpretations of this. And we can talk about it in terms of the discovery sequence and the presentation sequence. Now, the discovery sequence, anti-clockwise, is how the Buddha worked the whole thing out, either before his enlightenment or after it, or during it. And the other way round, and it's normally presented in this way, can be looked at as the presentation sequence, which is probably easier to understand. Okay, so I'll do it in the presentation sequence just for convenience. So let's have a look at it in some detail and keep the image up, Swadeepa. So we'll go around it in the clockwise direction.
Did you want the image up? Sorry.
Oh yeah, have the image up because I'll go around it and explain what all
Okay.
bits are. Sorry if I confused you. So the first one, which is meant to represent, or it's a blind man with a stick who's sort of trying to find his way. Actually, I've seen it said that if you look at the Pali text, Pali is the ancient Indian text that the Buddhist teachings were first written down in. It actually is feminine, so it's a blind woman. I think blind person better be the best way of saying that. So representing ignorance or delusion. It's a Pali term again, avidya, which is not knowing completely. The translation of that. So I said this earlier, actually, in talking about ignorance in the hub of the wheel. So it's not ignorance in the sense of lack of knowledge, but spiritual ignorance. Somebody might know a lot about the world, but still have a total lack of insight into the way things actually are, the true nature of reality. We've talked a bit about that. The wrong view that amassing possessions, getting plenty of money will bring, and these things will last, and other relationships as well. But we know this is not the case, or we know it intellectually anyway, although we don't always act as if we realise that. So the Buddha taught that this isn't the case. Looking for lasting satisfactions in things that are by nature impermanent is bound ultimately to bring disappointment. So we could put this in Buddhist terms of absence of right view. Right view in the sense of not knowing about the origin of dukkha. There's that word dukkha again, unsatisfactoriness. Life being a bumpy ride, like I said earlier, that's one way I like to describe dukkha. So not knowing the origin of this dukkha, and not knowing the cessation of dukkha and the path leading to the cessation of dukkha. So we're back to the Four Noble Truths, which of course includes the Eightfold Path, which is the path leading to the cessation of dukkha. Also, we could include in this spiritual ignorance the not believing the concept of karma, that volitional actions have consequences, that things are impermanent, etc. And we saw the karma being represented in the in the rim just outside the hub or the circle. So the second thing is a potter. A pottery's wheel. Now representing what we can call our deeply ingrained habits. The unconscious forces that are well-known tracks down which our lives proceed. We could say habitual ruts and tendencies. And these formations, these volitional formations, if we could call it that, are connected to the law of karma. The intentional acts of body, speech, and mind set up our ingrained personality traits and habits. Now, of course, there'll be good habits as well as bad. These bad habits, these unhelpful patterns of behaviour, cause problems for ourselves and others, leading to this dukkha, this suffering. So, independent upon these first two links and what arises out of this ignorance, we have the monkey climbing a tree, which represents consciousness. Now, in traditional terms, and we don't have to look at it in this way, but in traditional terms, it's said to represent consciousness passing from one life to the next, kind of relinking consciousness. And the monkey swinging from one tree to the next, like consciousness passing from existence to existence. But whether the Buddha meant it in this way, we don't know. As I said, he did believe in rebirth, but this sort of three life thing, which is said that this 12 links represent, he didn't say anything about that, but he did teach rebirth. But of course, we find the idea of rebirth difficult. I say belief in rebirth. I think it's better to say have some sort of gut feeling or intuition towards rebirth, because if you believe in it, it's more of a blind belief, isn't it? We don't really know. How do we experience the fact of rebirth? I think some Tibetans would say yes, because we get reborn lamas, but we don't know. It's a mystery of existence. So we don't have to accept the idea of rebirth to find these teachings useful. They're as effective as a metaphor, a story about human existence, and have an open mind about the mystery of existence. So we could look at this consciousness that arisen from ignorance and this karmic formation is giving rise to a sense of a separate self that's behind our sense experiences. And as many of you are probably aware, the Buddha taught that there's no enduring, unchanging self. Impermanence and insubstantiality negates that possibility that we've got an unchanging self. Somebody has said, we're not nouns, we're verbs, which I think is quite a good way of looking at it. So the next one, around 4 o'clock, the boat. This represents what we call name and form, nama rupa, to use the Pali words. It's our mind-body complex. There are other interpretations a bit more complicated, but let's say our psycho-physical form, mind and body. It's represented here by a boat containing 4 passengers, one steering. So the 4 passengers are the skandhas, what are they normally called? Aggregates, characteristics of human beings. No, form, feeling, perception, volition, and consciousness. Consciousness is the one that's steering the boat. So this teaching states that consciousness and name and form arise in dependence upon one another. Consciousness cannot arise without name and form cannot arise without consciousness. Consciousness is a necessary condition for name and form. And that text I mentioned, it's where the Buddha got, that was his last two links, that consciousness and name and form were interlinked, and that's what started the whole process off. Before he realized that there was a path out of this, a Noble Eightfold Path, and that dispels ignorance, which dispels these karmic tendencies, which give rise to our habits, which condition consciousness. Okay, well, I won't go any further with that, because I really want to focus on some of the later links, or the middle links, actually. So that in about 5 o'clock on the wheel, probably 4:30 o'clock, there's a house, picture of a house, and this represents the 6 sense organs, the 6 senses of sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, and mind. The first 5 senses are the windows, and mind is a door. Mind is a sense in Buddhist terminology. So, as a result of what's gone before in our lives, our memory and prior experience of things determines the way we experience the world. Yeah. So, we're now a functional human being with a body and mind, with senses to experience the world of what arises. So where do we go from here? And now we come to the probably the most important part of this sequence. If you don't fully understand the first few links, don't worry, because actually in the Mitra study guide to these 12 links, they totally ignore the first 4 links. Actually, just go straight to the next one, which is contact. So, as I said, we've got this we're a functional human being, and the sixth link is shown by a man and woman embracing. Yeah, you see that, and that represents contact. So these 6 senses have contact with outer objects, in dependence upon our senses we experience the world. So contact between an object, the sense organ, and sense consciousness arises. Okay? And we don't have to think about this. Impressions of what we've sensed naturally arise, which leads on to the 7th one, feeling. Sometimes we talk about Vedana, which just means feeling, represented by a man with an arrow stuck in the eye, which is a rather extreme form of feeling. So as a result of our contact arises feelings. And this just means that what we sense, the object we've sensed, we find either pleasant, neutral, or unpleasant. We've got no influence over this either. It's almost automatically based on our previous experience or memories, the way we feel about the feeling that arises, whether it's pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. But actually, feeling doesn't arise after the contact. It arises at the same time. So it's a bit misleading to have it as a link, because, you know, when we contact a piece of chocolate, which is a taste sense, we don't contact it and then after that we start to enjoy it. They happen at the same time, don't they? The sense contact and enjoyment happen together. But the way we look at it here, one arises out of the other, although it's a pretty instantaneous rise together, if you like. So, so these links up to now, we haven't got any control over. They happen as a result of previous action. Now we come to something that we can begin to have strive or have control over, and that is craving or aversion, a strong desire or thirst for something. Actually, the Pali word Trishna means thirst, which is craving or aversion, strong desire or strong dislike, pushing away. And that's represented by this image of a woman offering a drink to a man. Yeah, you see that? So craving for a pleasant sense experience. We have a pleasant sense experience. And as we find it pleasant, we want it to continue, don't we? It's the way we respond to this feeling. And we respond with aversion to something we don't like. And then it brings us on to the next link, the ninth link, grasping. Or perhaps a good translation is appropriation. We take something and use it as one's own. Craving and grasping are very similar in terms, isn't it? But they're distinguished by craving as the wanting something, and grasping as grabbing hold of it and keeping it. So we've got it by then. The craving is wanting it. The grasping arises when we've got it. Yeah. And that's represented by a man gathering fruit from a tree. So in dependence upon craving, this grasping or appropriation arises. So again, we unconsciously think that objects of our craving will bring real satisfaction. So we reach out for them and try and eliminate unpleasant things from us. So that's craving and grasping. And then we come on to becoming, represented by a pregnant woman. Now, there are many different interpretations of what this really signifies. Of course, the traditional interpretation is in terms of a literal rebirth. But we could interpret it as on the basis of well-worn behaviours, things arise, okay? Don't worry too much about these last three links, because I want to go back to the contact, feeling, craving and grasping, the important ones. So just to finish this off, the 12 links, you know, I've got your pregnant woman. That's represented becoming. As I said, there's different interpretations of this. We could say that craving leads to becoming because we're craving for existence, continued existence. That's one way we can look at it. But don't worry too much about making sense of these, because a lot of people find it's really struggle to get anything other than the traditional teaching out of this. It's a pregnant woman who then gives birth, and independence upon birth. As a result of birth, of course, everything that's born will die. So, but you can look at that again in a metaphorical sense, relating to a birth of a new experience, the relationship, job, phase in our life, and such like. So that experience might last for a while, and at some stage it will come to an end. That's one way we could look at that. But as I say, we won't go into these last three links in any detail. We'll not dwell on those. And let's go back to feeling and craving. And between feeling and craving is a weak link. Sangha said, it's the battleground of the spiritual life. As I think I said earlier, that up to this point, the point of feeling, with no real influence on what was happening. But at this point, the point between feeling and craving, we do have a choice. It's not a matter of inevitability. Craving is not inevitable. It's possible, albeit difficult, to observe feelings without reacting to them. So by practicing awareness or mindfulness of our feelings, we're less at mercy of our compulsions, our reactive behavior, our reactions, which you can look in terms of, Sangha actually uses the terms reactive mind and creative mind. So we can react creatively to, or we can respond creatively to a particular situation that's arisen from our feelings. So being aware of our feelings, we can create with mindfulness, awareness, we can create some distance between the feeling and the craving. It's the gap, as Sangha calls it, and it's really traditional in Buddhist teachings of this 12 links, but it's not normally emphasized that clearly. It offers us a way to jump off this wheel, to escape the rounds of this continuing series of rebirths, or become better humans in this life, this one life. We can have better relationships with others if we had a considered and thoughtful response to whatever arises, and reacting or responding creatively rather than reactively. These reactions depend on past experience that we've got no control over. They just arise, but we can be aware of that, and instead of just reacting, we can respond creatively. Okay. So just to summarize, through our ignorance of the way things really are, we develop a habitual way of relating to the world. So we get a particular perspective on things, which lead to an automatic response to things that are pleasant, painful, or neither painful nor pleasant, neutral if you like. So by grasping and pushing things away, either grasping or pushing things away, these responses, these habitual responses reinforce ingrained habits. We'll go round and round in this wheel of existence, this cyclic conditionality, which is characteristic of the unenlightened mind. So this gap is how we get off the wheel, and the gap leading to the spiral path. And I'll be talking about the spiral path this afternoon. Okay, so we'll finish there.